Hello, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Barcode, a podcast brought to you by Tompkins Solutions. I'm Tony Del Cid, and on today's episode, I sit down with Mark Fralick, Chief Technology Officer at Softeon.
The machine uses only two sounds produced electrically.
In our conversations, we'll cover topics such as some of the pressing questions that clients are asking, what some of the pitfalls are that you may fall into when implementing technology, and some of the new exciting features in WMS land. So without further ado, let's hear what Mark had to say. Mark, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for taking some time out of your day to speak with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure to be here.
Now, why don't we start with, for those folks that may not be familiar with yourself or with Softeon, why don't you give us a little background on yourself and a little bit about Softeon?
Sure. Well, I'm lucky enough I love this business. I've been lucky enough to be in this business since about 1988. I joined a company called McHugh back in the day, which then became Red Prairie, JDA, Blue Yonder. But worked back in the day, and after working at McHugh for several years, Jim Heflin and I, with Jim's our current CEO at Softeon, split off from McHugh and created a little company called Software Architects. And we actually built the WMS that's currently owned in the primary WMS offered by Blue Yonder. We sold it to them, and worked for them for a number of years through our contract period. And then I created a little implementation business because I'm not a corner office. I'm not an office guy at all, actually. I'm all like a run around the DC, finding stuff to do. But so I created a little implementation company and ran it for about 20 years. We did, implementation all over the world. I think we're up to 16 countries at one point. And
Wow.
when Jim took on the reins as CEO at Softeon, he knew that the work that we had been doing, both implementations, but we had built a lot of intellectual property around how to do implementations really well, as far as communicating with all kinds of different things and just ways to do things a bit more modern, than typically was done in the field. And he asked us to come on, and we proposed that opportunity. It was great because Softeon, I was well aware of, because they're always in the top. When I viewed them, they were always in the top, of the WMS. And I looked at that opportunity to say, hey, we could bring our folks and our intellectual property and merge it into what was going on at Softeon. It was a great thing. And we at Softeon, we were the first to the cloud. We were first to the web, first to the cloud. And really had that sense of things all along. And for me to come in and again bring our people and our processes and some of our tech was a great opportunity. And Softeon, like I said, first to the cloud, one of the main top WMS providers for the last 20 years, and it was a great opportunity for me.
Awesome. Yeah. And I will vouch. I know sitting in on some, evaluation projects many years ago, that you definitely were some of the earlier people I was hearing bringing up this elusive cloud.
Yeah, the cloud. It's going to be big someday. Plastics, it's going to be big.
Yeah. Now, Mark, it sounds like obviously you guys are what we'll call in the industry doing a lot of stuff on the front end, right? Having those conversations with potential clients or existing clients looking to make modifications. Right. So can you maybe go over some of what you're hearing in these conversations, and maybe some of the more pressing or more commonly heard questions or concerns that they're bringing up in their conversations with you?
Sure. I think that really the conversations still remain largely, a lot around labor, right? And labor availability, labor costs, and I think that really since the pandemic, especially, it really, the focus on that has been much, much greater, because back in the day when I first started, we would say sometimes that people in the warehouse were either at the beginning or the ends of their careers. But now you can make a very nice living, working warehousing, and especially with people
Yep.
that do, incentive-based pay and things like that. And so there's a lot of competition, and in every town that has DCs, they're typically co-located. You go down Warehouse Alley, right? And it's
Yeah.
all
Oh yeah.
these, I don't even know how they get trucks in and out of there sometimes because there's so many warehouses piled up against each other. But people can go across the street for 5 cents an hour, or a better gig, or better ergonomics, or a better work situation. So I think it's hard to keep labor. It's hard to attract labor sometimes. Hard to keep labor when it's so focused around a nucleus of companies that are all trying to attract the same resources. And then simultaneously, what's happened is, like, push to robotics or the push to automation has really, been focused around those kinds of issues, right? Labor availability, keeping folks employed, in your DC versus walking across the street, but also handling scalability differences better, because sometimes the question about automation is one about labor availability, and sometimes it's about more scalability, and those are two edges of the same knife.
Yep. No, for sure. And so you've brought up labor and robotics, automation in your response. So, and as we discuss with clients, with others, colleagues, right? It really is an exciting time in this industry, right? With all the different options out there, all the different variations of robotics. It really is exciting to go to the shows, right? You're just looking at what's new, what's next, what am I not even thinking of?
Yeah.
So kind of from your perspective, what are your thoughts on where someone would even start as it relates to WMS and how that would integrate with some of these technologies out there in the marketplace?
Right. I think, and this will air right after ProMat probably, and the people coming back from
Correct.
ProMat will have sort of a dizzying view of the world because there's so much stuff. There's just so many different versions of things, so many different approaches to things, so many different variations. The nuances of things is different. So it can be, like I said, I use the word dizzying. It's a very, and I think it's accurate, right? I
Hmm.
actually had some last year at Modex, which is the sister show to ProMat. Somebody came through after they walked through the facility, and they said, I came here to start making decision, and I'm even more confused than ever, right? That, this did me, and I said, okay,
Did more damage
yeah,
than
it's
good.
because it's just like, there's so many different things. And I think that the main thing that I always think about is, like, okay, before you even put your toe in the water, right? Just get a sense of, like, what's your operational goals, like a 2 year or 3 year operational goal would be, because it's so easy to get enamored with low hanging fruit or things that you could achieve fast. And those might be good things, right? Obviously, ROI, speed to ROI is always, that's always good. The problem that you have is opportunity cost, right? So if you make a decision, prematurely make a decision, and you're taking up floor space is a resource, right? It's an expensive one.
Yep.
Um, you know, does that stop you from making other decisions? Like, even if you do something, a lot of the robots vendors have gotten into some very innovative ways to approach the economics of this, right? So instead of it being predominantly a capex sort of thing, it's an opex sort of thing, where it's almost
Right.
like, you're hiring a robot month to month, right? So, but there's still infrastructure for chargers, and you might have to run electricity, a higher level electricity, different wireless. So there's just there are costs to it. So I think it's important to think about your vision of this thing, and then start looking at the technology that helps you achieve that vision.
No, for sure. And yeah, you don't want to sacrifice your future for a quick hit, right?
Right.
I mean, we've all been in facilities where they implemented something and they're not using it
No,
anymore,
I mean, yeah.
right? And that probably costs someone or several people their jobs probably in
Yeah.
the long run. So
Yeah, absolutely.
no, for sure. for sure. Much in the same way that technology is kind of breaking barriers and expanding its outreach and what it covers. A lot can be said, or similar things are happening within the world of software. So I think a lot of people probably have an idea of what a WES, what a WMS does. And really, you're seeing some overlap, right, where the WESs are going up and the WMSs are going down. So, can you speak to what some of the functions and functionality that you guys offer as part of Softeon, and maybe some of the things that aren't a typical WMS offering that you guys have available for your clients?
Sure. And that's just to get the names sort of situated. So at the lowest level, people normally think about the conveyor level, controls level as WCS.
Right.
And at the highest level, coordinating orders and flows of the system overall, they think about that as a WMS responsibility. And in the medium, kind of area, there's been a lot of work over the last 20 years. Actually, this has been a growing thing of the warehouse execution, the E is execution, which means they're taking directions from the WMS, right? But they're actually executing, right? And so
Right.
what I think that a lot of the WMS vendors, I actually wrote an article about this, is I said that I think a lot of the WMS vendors lost their minds in like the mid 2000s. Like they forgot how to do stuff on the floor. Luckily, Softeon, when I came to Softeon, one of the things that I found was that Softeon actually has a WES um, component. It's actually it's something that can be run inside of our WMS or run separately. But um, so it really speaks to like, and I'll just say what it really does. Execution and orchestration is what the WES components of a system do, whether it's a WES or a WMS that has a WES. It's execution, things focused on execution and orchestration. So things focused on execution might be optimizing, picking experience or voice picking and coordinating all that with the flows of the rest of your system. Orchestration really is about kind of understanding that, there's competing elements. If you think about like a WMS, I always think about like a warehouse as this idea of trying to get multiple business microflows going on simultaneously, and sometimes they're competing, right? And so they're competing for resources,
Right.
they're competing for attention, they might be competing for staging lanes or things like that. So like the WES helps you deal with that competing part of things. Like if you're saying I'm competing
Right.
for down lanes, or I'm competing for resources, or I'm competing for staging lanes, right? A good WES will start looking at those resources and say, hey, how do I optimize my flow based on limited resource availability, or increasing the priority of things that need to be done to meet the SLAs of in by 2, out by 5, or whatever your SLAs are. So those kind of components are really driven by that sort of orchestration layer, and the new something new that Gartner is talking about, which is multi-vendor orchestration, which is the way things are going in the future, I think.
No, for sure. And that's 100% spot on, because I think you're also seeing on the equipment side, right? There's not one shoe fits all approach to technology and to automation. So you're seeing different vendors having to be orchestrated and coordinated and integrated, right, inside the four walls of the facility, and not all provided by the same provider.
Yeah. Right. And Gartner really was ahead on a lot of this, talking about a lot of this, for the last couple of years. This multi-vendor orchestration multi-vendor could mean hardware vendors, could mean software vendors, could
Right.
be AI, right? They were really ahead of that was a really good call on their part. I mean, obviously they're smart guys, right? There's super smart guys there. And but that was one of the things that, we actually saw that my company, prior to joining on with Softeon, we actually had been working on this since about 2016, seeing the fact that this idea of a single vendor controlling the floor is long, those days are long gone. And, anybody who still has that idea is, one, just has a myopic view, and two is, amazingly tone deaf, because of what's going on out there in the facilities, and what's going on out there in the market. So this ability to do that orchestration, but do it for multiple vendors, is something that is relatively new in terms of thought process. And a lot of the traditional WESs that came up from hardware vendors don't do that extremely well because their stuff is tuned to, they sell it with their hardware, they sell it with their. So I think that the independent WES, folks have done, a better job, I think, of doing this multi-vendor orchestration. And obviously, that's been the sense of what we've been doing at Softeon.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Now, a couple of other keywords that you're hearing a lot, and I'm sure you're definitely hearing it in today's world, is AI and machine learning, right? And everything and anything involved with that. So can you speak about how Softeon utilizes AI and machine learning in your software, the benefits you see from it, and any potential future expansion upon this within Softeon?
Yeah, I think it's good first to talk about AI as a thing, because it just means different things to different people, and people say AI and they immediately, when somebody says it to me, I'm like, well, the first thing I want to do is understand what the heck you're talking about, right? Are you talking about Gen AI? Are you talking about predictive? Are you what are you talking about? So if you think about historically the way people have thought about it in the last 2 years since OpenAI, really came through with, ChatGPT and stuff like that. It's about generative AI, or LLMs, a large language model. So generative AI is great for answering questions and having conversations, and doing we use it for just from the way we use that is as a configuration advisor to say, hey, you can ask, how do I need to set up my replens in this situation? And we can set up, it can help guide you through the process of setting up replens. Or, what is a replen and how do I need to set it up? Answering questions about, just when somebody mentions this, what is it that, what's a pick face and how does it, all those kinds of questions and configure. So that's a great generative AI use of that. We also use it, for instance, if for doing integrations, you can just drop in a vendor will have examples, like they'll have an example format of their JSON or their XML. You can just drop it in, and we'll use Gen AI to create the last mile of the interface, so you don't have to know as to program that, right? So those are great uses of that, and the Gen AI is going to, that's the fastest. Those are the fastest things that are going to be improvements out there, because Gen AI has become so available in way different ways. And but it's a very particular use case. That's why I say when people talk AI, a lot of times they're thinking Gen AI. They might be thinking Gen AI, but we use it in a couple different ways. There's something else that you can think of as predictive AI, and that is to look at what's going on and then predict what might happen next, right? So look at the data that's typically happening, and then realize that, hey, so we can send that stuff through machine learning and say, hey, we know that we may need on this Tuesday, following this event, we need to add additional resources here, right? Because typically what happens is we get a spike and blah blah blah. That would be in the predictive AI, and we use predictive AI. We're using predictive AI in that sort of way, but also to sort of tune the flow of the facility to say, now we may need to say, okay, a lot of warehouse managers say, hey, what do I need today to do my business, and when, right? And so, we might say, hey, you need to get people in afternoon, because that noon to 2 on these days, right, is the big push to meet your SLAs. You don't need people in the morning because your orders aren't in, you don't have your replens done or whatever. So I think that level of orchestration, it helps with that. And then finally, there's an additional type of AI that we're using called causal AI, and that is to really kind of back yourself into what causes those things. And that's almost purely machine learning driving those sorts of evaluations. So those sorts of the 3 buckets that we think about, but mostly people think about it as a Gen AI.
And I think, coming from an operations background, certainly the engineer and planner in me, I think the predictive portion is probably the most exciting, right? I mean, you said it yourself. You've been in a ton of facilities. I've been in facilities that low automation run like a charm, right? I mean, it's like a symphony going on in there. And then you've been in facilities that automated to the gills, and it's total chaos,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
you could set up all the models, do all the math, as we like to say. But really, to some degree, wave and workflow planning is almost as much of an art as it is a
Yeah,
science.
there's so much nuance to it, right? Is to, like, hey, what we should be doing to maximize your throughput is to be threading in these types of orders, your singles, right? Like in an ecom, right? You always
Yep.
cherry pick your singles, right? So you cherry pick your singles and then thread in your multis so that as you're going and you cherry picking your singles, you're also hitting the multis that need to be out for your SLA. So that kind of combination, to your point, is super important, right? In getting the
Yep.
flow of a facility. Because I always say, like, it's facility is not about speed, it's about flow, man. It's totally about
Oh yeah.
flow.
Yep. No, for sure. 100%. Um, so obviously, a lot of experience, a lot of different facilities you've been in, and a lot of different technologies you've seen implemented is part of your systems that you're involved in. Given your experience, what would you say are some of the more common traps you might see some of your clients or potential clients falling into in the implementing of this automation and getting all this stuff integrated?
Yeah. I think it's a really good question. And you could tell by my luxurious gray hair, I've been around. And I think on my LinkedIn, I think I have it. I think I have my current number is 88 and 0 for go lives. I think it's something like, it might be
Wow.
87 and 0, something like that. I don't think I updated the last go live that I just did last month, but yeah, I'm a guy that likes to be out on the floor, obviously. Um, so yeah, I think that I think that there's just a lot going on, right? There's a lot going on out there, and my concern with folks is that uh, I guess I would say is, like, it's important to keep your wits about you, right? And say and to say, hey, all the things that are going on, what things am I going to use to achieve my ultimate goal in my facility, right? So your ultimate goals, right, might be about that idea of handling labor availability, right? It might be about, and for a lot of people, it's about scalability, right? It's handling the scale
Right.
on and so I think that the important thing I always say is, no matter what you're doing from an automation perspective, whether you do bolt-down automation, which, by the way, I don't want to hate on bolt-down automation, but I'm really leaning against bolt-down automation these days. I like having robots that we can shift around and we don't have bolted down. How many times have you been? You've been in situations like you got bolt down technology, and then your order volume, your order profile changes, and the bolt down stuff doesn't
Yeah.
work anymore, but it's all bolted down, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so part of this has got to be like, hey, do you have a sense of, like, where your market is going and how that might change in the way you're doing business? Like, are you handling more stuff through drop ships? Are you doing more maybe you're doing more value added services in your facility? Like, how is that going to change? Because that's going to change the way you need to approach things going forward. And the key thing that I always tell people to concentrate on is what that North Star, the 2 or 3 year North Star. I wouldn't go beyond that because things are so unpredictable. But if you could say, hey, look, I got a 3 year North Star of this, because you know what? I know that I can do my amortization of any costs over 3 years. And then that really and technology is changing so much that 3 years from now, you're going to look at this and say, holy cow, there's all kinds of new stuff that I should be doing. And so that's the thing, is to set your North Star, make sure you're in line with the way your business operates, and that you're holding your vendors to the same approach, to say, look, if you're coming to me with and all the vendors are gotten really good at doing ROI projections and FTE production numbers and things, like they can increase the production of FTE by 2.3% or 2.3 times or whatever the number is. I would just make sure you're holding all those vendors to the same numbers, because otherwise it just gets too crazy to make any kind of comparisons.
No, for sure, for sure. And you can certainly, run into analysis
Yes.
paralysis, right? As they say,
Yeah.
and just get buried, flooded
Yeah, and
by the
I think that
data.
is, like I said, we said about, like, going to some place like ProMat, it's dizzying, and again, but if you I would say this to your point, Tony, is like, I wouldn't get into that whole like specific ROI and FTE production rates and things like that until you've got it down to 2 or 3 vendors. Like if you got it down to your final 2 or 3 vendors, then hold their feet to the fire on their numbers and say, because then you're basically saying, okay, based on those numbers, and you can get you references, from us and the hardware vendors and whatever about, FTE production and blah, blah, blah. Based on those things, then you can go back to your management and say, look, based on these numbers, here's what we're going to get out of this. Here's how we're going to handle peak seasons, et cetera. And here's the payback period. It's going to be 26 months or 28 months or whatever it is.
Yep. Yep. Wholeheartedly agree. I want to circle back. Earlier in an answer, you had brought up the idea of multi-vendor, multi-agent orchestration, right? And gave us kind of a brief overview on that. Can you maybe take it a step further and elaborate on how Softeon is approaching this topic?
Yeah, it's interesting because back when I think I mentioned this, back when I first started, right? The WMS vendors thought that they owned the floor, right? And so now, now in these days, right, the floor is the floor is a battlefield for ROI in my book, right? And so I always kind of view it like that. It is the battlefield for ROI, and so I think you as a vendor, right, and you as the customers out there need to think of it that way. Is like this is a battlefield for ROI, and it is ever changing and quickly changing, and there's so many different options on it. This idea that a particular vendor runs everything from cradle to grave in your facility is that was done 10 years ago, right? So now I think some of them, it's funny because some of the vendors still don't believe that, right? And they're kind of holding on. They're like, we have all the keys, and like, well, they're jumping over the fence, and it doesn't make any difference if you have the keys to the gates if they're jumping over the fence to look at. Well, like Tony, you know this. The one thing we know about ops is they will get stuff done, right? They will figure out how to get stuff done, and
Oh yeah.
and so I think what we have to do is admit that, look, and we've taken this approach, is that the best situation for customer A is not going to be the same best situation for customer B, and the technology could be vastly different. Could be AI agents involved, could be robotic agents involved, could be obviously human associates involved, and so the right combination of those things will differ. The important thing is you have to be able to support all of it. And that's the
Right.
difference. And when Gartner was talking about their multi-vendor orchestration, which they did a nice call out to us about that, is you have to really, it's one of those things where I feel like you have to be, all in on, right? It's not, you can't be half in and say you're multi-vendor, multi-vendor orchestration, right? So I think that's the important
Oh
thing.
yeah. No, for sure. You definitely have to be committed,
Yeah.
for lack of a better term.
Exactly, right. Yeah.
To your decision, or it won't pan out.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Now you'd mentioned earlier, obviously this podcast episode will air after ProMat, so there's just all kinds of information, right, and probably to some degree information overload for some of our listeners that maybe are very interested in, but are very low end automation, right? Maybe running off a homegrown software package. Outside of ProMat, is there anywhere that any potential clients might be able to interact with you, see demonstrations, exhibits, talk to you?
Yeah, I mean, we're, I would say that, the top folks are always out there, and, we are always interested in having conversations. And the thing that I was talking to your producer here is I view myself as an evangelist for effective warehouse solutions, not, and obviously, I'd love for you to use our solution. My main thing, and I've been doing this for a long time, as just like you, I just want to have people be successful doing their systems. And so people call me all the time, ask my opinion, or contact me on LinkedIn and ask my opinion about a particular technology, or if I know these guys. And so folks like me, and I think you're like this too. We just want to have people be successful. So from my perspective,
Yeah.
if you see things at ProMat, you want to know my opinion. If I know them, I will give you my opinion about it, pretty unvarnished. If you've ever read anything that I've written on LinkedIn, I have a very unvarnished view of the world because I come from the floor. I'm an ops guy that knows technology, or I'm a technology guy that knows ops, and that's where I come from. So yeah, feel free to ping me on LinkedIn, and we're out there doing other events. I'm speaking at Gartner Symposium this year, and so
Awesome.
those are kind of places where I'll also be.
No, for sure. Obviously from day one when Jim founded the company, we were very much, Jim's an educator.
Yeah.
So, we're just as much about educating our clients as much as we are trying to help them develop solutions and solve their problems.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the last thing you want to do is have an implementation that's the wrong implementation just to get a win.
No, yeah, and I think that it's funny because I used to sit in on those back in the day when I was when I had much darker hair and but I used to I've known folks from Tompkins, and I knew Jim back in the day, and so yeah, it's funny because that's why a place like Tompkins still exists, right? Is and
Right.
some of the best people out there. That's why they still are out there, because they don't take those half-baked solutions. They don't go for the quick wins. They go for the wins that make sense to people and look at long-term relationships. And this business is, this is, if you go to these shows, this is a relationship business. You see people that have been doing this for a long time,
No, for
because
sure.
it's one of those crazy relationship businesses. It doesn't seem like it should be because it's like warehousing, whatever, but it's a relationship business.
We're a special bunch.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I was just telling someone, the show, I always set up a schedule and I always throw it out the window
Yeah,
as soon as I get
I
there,
know.
because you'll start crossing paths with, past clients, past suppliers,
Yeah.
former colleagues. Yeah, that's just as exciting as seeing the equipment that's out
Yeah,
there.
and I think the people that do this well, right, and are are the are people of their word, and stick behind their work, right? They're the people that you want to
Right.
see. You want to see keep coming back, right? Because the guy that shoves something into a place, like, he's not going to be around. He or she is not going to be around next year because no one wants to talk to that person. Like, you're like shunning that person because so yeah, so that's it makes for an interesting interesting industry when hopefully the folks that like I try to obviously I'm 88 and 0, but you know um I think that you just try and do the right thing for customers, right?
Yeah, and it shows. Now, final topic, and I always end with this question, make it a little personal and non-work related, but obviously in this industry, we tend to be a little bit of road warriors, and the road can beat you up a little bit, so to speak. So for those of us that look for some entertainment during our downtime on a flight or in the hotel room, is there any musician, book, series, or anything out there right now that has your attention you think would be great to share with our listeners?
I'm actually
We've
reading.
got show and tell.
Yes, I
I
am
love it.
actually reading a very interesting book called A Hero with a Thousand Faces. And, I go back and forth between, fiction, nonfiction, and things. So this is a book that is the basic, it talks about the basic archetypes types of heroes in this book was largely used to define the heroes and villains in Star Wars and things like that. But it
Oh,
was it
wow.
was written like 100 years ago or whatever. But my son, who was in film school, turned me on to it, and it's so interesting because it just talks about the genesis of this, and you can see the even in like way old mythology, you can see the pieces of Luke Skywalker, you can see the pieces of Darth Vader and things like that. So
Awesome.
yeah, I think that's one of the more interesting books that I've read in a while, and it's really beautifully written, by the way. It makes you think, and I do a bit of writing, and it made me think, oh my gosh, I write like a 5-year-old compared to this guy. But yeah, so that's
Yeah.
it.
There's a difference between writing for an engineering
Yeah.
purpose, right, and writing for an entertainment
Yeah,
purpose.
no, it's true. It's true. But it's a great book and I'm enjoying it a lot. But yeah. And I'm not a guy to talk about. I'm so far behind because I'm my wife and I are just getting caught up on Breaking Bad. So it tells you how
Oh man,
how far behind I am on stuff. So, but I recommend Breaking Bad if you haven't watched it.
oh, I love it. I'm the same way. I recommend it. Yeah, and I usually wait till the hubbub
Yeah,
dies down, right, and then
yeah,
watch it afterwards. Well,
exactly, exactly.
Mark, it's been a pleasure catching up. I appreciate the knowledge you shared with us, and thank you so much for joining the show.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.